case. 22-year-old Roberta Wall was killed in 1986, and for 4 decades, her murder went unsolved. Thank you for joining us on Fox 43. I'm Julia Avery.
And I'm Katie Collette. With the help of technology, though, police were able to recently arrest a man in Connecticut.
In the early hours of 15 May 1986, a passerby walking across the grounds of Old Donation Elementary School in Virginia Beach, Virginia, discovered a body lying on the grass behind the school building. It was Roberta Walls, a 2-year-old woman whom her friends affectionately called Bobby. She had suffered multiple stab wounds, and investigators found evidence indicating she had also been the victim of a brutal sexual assault. The place where she was found was only a few steps from the Bayside Public Library, where she volunteered every day. Police recovered a DNA sample from the crime scene, but it took 15 years before they were able to develop a usable DNA profile. Even then, that profile sat in the national database for another 22 years without producing a single match. The person who left that biological evidence had never been arrested for any offense during those 4 decades, becoming a ghost within the case file. Someone who existed only through a DNA profile with no name attached to it. It was not until May 2026, nearly 40 years after that tragic night, that the truth was finally uncovered. Who was the man who took Bobby's life, just outside the place where she had devoted so much of her time? And why did it take 4 decades for a single DNA trace to finally reveal the identity of the person who left it behind? Join me as we reopen every chapter of this remarkable cold case. And if you enjoy true crime stories like this, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next case. Roberta Walls grew up in the Hampton Roads region of Virginia, a coastal area well known for its cluster of neighboring port cities. She spent much of her time between the Aragona neighborhood of Virginia Beach and Ocean View in Norfolk, 2 close-knit communities where most of her friendships and social connections were formed and nurtured from an early age. Everyone who knew Roberta remembered her with great affection. In documents released years later, police described her as a vibrant young woman with a bright future ahead of her, the very picture of a 2-year-old beginning to build a life of her own. To her family, she was a devoted daughter and a loving sister whom everyone could depend on whenever they needed her. Roberta was also distinctive in appearance, with tattoos on her arm and abdomen, something that stood out during the mid-1980s, when tattoos were far less common than they are today. But what truly left a lasting impression on those around her was not her appearance. It was her kindness and the warmth she showed to everyone she met. At the time, Roberta volunteered at the Bayside Public Library on Ferry Plantation Drive in Virginia Beach. It was more than just a volunteer position. It was where she spent much of her day, helping library patrons, organizing books, and gradually building the familiar routine that had become an important part of her life. It was on that quiet stretch of Ferry Plantation Drive, home to both the library where Roberta volunteered and the elementary school directly across the road, that a terrible tragedy was about to unfold, changing the course of her promising young life forever. Directly opposite the Bayside Public Library, where Roberta spent much of her time, stood another familiar landmark in the neighborhood, Old Donation Elementary School. The school was a single-story brick building with a spacious car park at the front and a wide grassy field stretching behind it towards a line of trees at the edge of the property. During the day, the area was full of life. Children's laughter echoed across the playground during recess, while parents regularly arrived in the afternoon to collect their children after school. It was the picture of a peaceful suburban community, where the school and library served as 2 closely connected centers of everyday life. But once the sun went down, the atmosphere changed completely. The library's car park emptied soon after closing time, and the school fell silent, with no signs of activity remaining. One important detail was that the street lighting along Ferry Plantation Drive did not extend far enough to illuminate the grassy field behind the school. That area had no fencing, no lighting of its own, and the nearest homes were too far away for anyone to see what might be happening in the darkness. For long-time Bayside residents, the field behind the school was simply another familiar part of the neighborhood, woven into the rhythm of daily life. No one ever imagined it could become a place of danger. Yet it was precisely that quiet, seemingly harmless isolation that, after nightfall, concealed a threat no one in the community could have foreseen. The 14 May 1986 began like any other ordinary day in Roberta's life. She completed her usual shift at the Bayside Public Library, helping patrons and organizing books, with nothing to suggest that this day would be any different from the hundreds that had come before. That evening, after finishing work, Roberta left the library with plans to meet up with friends, something entirely typical for a 2-year-old enjoying her youth. This was an area she had known since childhood, a place where she felt completely at ease and had no reason to fear traveling alone. There was no indication that Roberta felt anxious or sensed that anything was wrong that night. To her, it was simply another Wednesday evening, spent catching up with close friends. Sometime around midnight, Roberta made a telephone call to the friend she was planning to meet. It was a brief conversation, simply confirming their plans. There was nothing unusual about what was said, nor anything in her voice to suggest that anything was amiss. Yet no one at that moment, not even Roberta herself, could have imagined that the short phone call would become the last time anyone who knew her would ever hear her voice. After that fateful call, Roberta's movements throughout the rest of the night almost completely disappeared from the record. No witness could say exactly where she went, whom she met, or what brought her to the area near Old Donation Elementary School at the very moment her fate was about to change forever. Sometime after midnight, in the early hours of 15 May 1986, one of the most brutal crimes Virginia Beach had ever witnessed unfolded on the isolated grassy field behind Old Donation Elementary School. Roberta was subjected to a savage attack. According to the official police investigation, she suffered obvious signs of trauma consistent with an extremely violent assault. She was stabbed multiple times with a sharp weapon and was sexually assaulted before her death. The severity of her injuries later led investigators to conclude that this was not simply a crime committed in the heat of the moment. Instead, it reflected a level of violence that far exceeded what would have been necessary to overpower a lone victim who had no means of defending herself in the darkness. The location itself, a field with no lighting, no passing pedestrians, and well beyond the view of the nearest homes, became the perfect setting for such a crime to take place unseen. No one witnessed the attack, and no cries for help were heard. Even today, many of the specific details surrounding the assault, including the exact timeline, the sequence of events, and whether Roberta ever realized who was attacking her, have never been publicly disclosed by investigators. For nearly 4 decades, those missing pieces of the story were known to only one person, the individual responsible for the crime. That night, the quiet, grassy field behind the elementary school, a place normally associated with children playing during the day, became the scene of one of the most haunting and enduring murder investigations in the history of Virginia Beach. A mystery that would remain unsolved for almost half a century. At approximately 6:30 a.m., on 15 May 1986, what had begun as an ordinary morning in the quiet Bayside community took a horrifying turn when a passerby walking across the grounds of Old Donation Elementary School suddenly stopped in their tracks. Before them lay a sight no one should ever have to witness: a body lying motionless on the grassy field behind the school. Just a few hours earlier, the area had been shrouded in darkness, with nothing to alert anyone passing by during the night that a terrible crime had taken place. The witness immediately contacted emergency services. Within minutes, reports of a serious incident were broadcast over police radio, and the first responding officers were dispatched to the scene. On what should have been another routine Thursday morning, a place normally filled with children arriving for school was transformed into the center of one of the most significant homicide investigations Virginia Beach had ever faced. The victim was quickly identified as Roberta Walls, the young woman who, only hours earlier, had made what would unknowingly become the final phone call of her life. Neither she nor anyone who spoke with her could have imagined it would be the last time her voice would ever be heard. News of Roberta's death spread rapidly through the close-knit community where she had lived and worked, leaving colleagues at the library, close friends, and members of her family devastated by the loss. But that heartbreaking morning marked only the beginning of an investigation that would stretch across 4 decades, far longer than anyone standing at that crime scene could ever have imagined. As soon as the scene was secured, crime scene investigators and forensic specialists arrived to begin a meticulous examination of the area. Their initial assessment confirmed that Roberta had suffered multiple wounds inflicted by a sharp-edged weapon. They also found clear evidence that she had been sexually assaulted before her death. The extent of her injuries reflected the extreme level of violence investigators recognized from the very first moments they examined the scene. Forensic specialists then collected biological evidence from the crime scene, including material that potentially contained the offender's genetic profile. It was a critical step in the investigation. However, in 1986, DNA forensic science in the United States was still in its infancy and lacked the capability to process and analyze biological evidence with the speed and sophistication that would become common in later decades. Every sample recovered was carefully sealed and preserved according to strict evidence handling procedures, becoming one of the case's most important foundations. At the time, none of the investigators could have imagined that these seemingly insignificant pieces of evidence would have to wait for decades before modern science could finally unlock their full value. As for the detailed autopsy report, authorities have never publicly released specific information such as the exact time of death or the precise number of wounds sustained by the victim. Those details have remained confidential, as they are typically disclosed only during formal court proceedings. With the evidence gathered from the crime scene, the official investigation was launched. Yet none of the detectives working that morning in 1986 could have imagined that the case they had just begun would become an investigation spanning decades before it would finally reach a breakthrough. During the first weeks and months after the murder, investigators worked tirelessly to identify the person responsible. They interviewed witnesses, examined Roberta's personal relationships, and pursued every lead, no matter how small. But as time passed, every avenue gradually reached a dead end. There were no eyewitnesses to the attack, no security cameras had captured what happened, and the offender seemed to have disappeared without leaving behind anything that could reveal his identity. Eventually, the case was transferred to the Virginia Beach Police Department's Cold Case Unit, where the file was preserved and periodically reviewed whenever new investigative technologies became available. The first major breakthrough did not come until 2001, 15 years after that fateful night. Thanks to advances in forensic genetics, specialists from the Virginia Department of Forensic Science were finally able to develop a complete DNA profile from the biological evidence that had been carefully preserved for all those years. That DNA profile was then entered into the Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, the United States National DNA Database, which contains millions of genetic profiles collected from individuals who have been arrested or convicted across the country. In principle, every time a new DNA profile is added, whether from an old crime scene or from someone newly arrested for an unrelated offense, the system automatically compares it against existing profiles in search of a match. Yet for the next 22 years, Roberta Walls's DNA profile remained in the database without producing a single hit. The reason only became clear much later. The individual who had left the biological evidence at the crime scene had never been arrested for any offense during that entire period. As a result, his DNA had never been entered into the system, leaving nothing for CODIS to match against. In other words, investigators already possessed the killer's biological signature, but it belonged to someone who was effectively invisible to every law enforcement database, a man whose life had never intersected with the criminal justice system in any way that would have revealed his identity. For many years, the DNA evidence collected in 1986 sat dormant among hundreds of other unsolved cold cases, almost forgotten until investigators decided to re-examine it, taking advantage of the remarkable advances in forensic genetic technology that had emerged since the original analysis more than 2 decades earlier. This time, rather than simply waiting for an automatic hit from the National DNA Database, as they had for the previous 22 years without success, forensic scientists carried out a far more comprehensive, direct DNA comparison that went well beyond the standard automated database search. That decision finally produced the breakthrough investigators had been waiting for nearly 4 decades. The source of the DNA profile, first developed in 2001, was finally identified as Charles Randall Barry, who was 66 years old and living quietly in the town of Newington, Connecticut, hundreds of miles from the crime scene and nearly half a century removed from the night of the murder. On 18 May 2026, almost exactly 40 years after the events of May 1986, Barry was formally arrested. The arrest was carried out by the Newington Police Department on behalf of the Virginia Beach Police Department's Cold Case Unit, the team that had quietly pursued the investigation through multiple generations of detectives, from those who first opened the case in 1986 to the investigators working it today. The arrest was the result of a large-scale collaborative effort involving multiple agencies, including the Virginia State Police, the Virginia Attorney General's Office, and the Virginia Beach Commonwealth's Attorney's Office. Together, they succeeded in bringing back to face justice a man who had seemingly escaped accountability for an entire lifetime. After spending 40 years living as an invisible figure in the eyes of the law, building an entirely new life in another state far removed from both the crime scene and the passage of time, Charles Barry was finally forced to confront what investigators allege he had done on that fateful night in May 1986. Following his arrest in Connecticut, Charles Barry was processed through the initial stages of the American criminal justice system in accordance with standard legal procedures. He is currently being held on $10 million bail, an amount that reflects the seriousness of the charges he is expected to face, while also indicating that authorities consider him to present a significant flight risk after having remained undetected for 4 decades. As of now, investigators have not publicly disclosed any details of Barry's post-arrest interviews, including whether he made any statements, admitted or denied the allegations, or chose to exercise his constitutional right to remain silent. The only official comments released have come from investigators. Captain Michelle Wyatt, representing the Virginia Beach Police Department's Criminal Investigations Division, said that although the case remains profoundly heartbreaking, there is comfort in finally having answers, after so many years of waiting. While details of the investigation remain confidential, the legal process to extradite Barry from Connecticut back to Virginia is continuing. That step must be completed before he can formally face criminal charges in the jurisdiction where the crime allegedly occurred, rather than in the state where he spent the past 40 years living quietly. Behind the closed doors of the prosecutor's office, a comprehensive legal case is steadily being assembled in preparation for the proceedings that lie ahead. In any criminal case, the arrest of a suspect is only the beginning. Equally important is building a case strong enough to withstand scrutiny in court. In Charles Barry's case, the entire prosecution rests upon a single piece of evidence with decisive weight: the results of a direct DNA comparison. Specifically, forensic experts compared the biological evidence collected from the 1,986 crime scene directly against Charles Barry's own DNA sample. This was far more than a routine automated database search like the one that had produced no results for 22 years. Instead, it was a comprehensive, direct forensic comparison that proved pivotal to the entire investigation. Captain Michelle Wyatt of the Virginia Beach Police Department's Criminal Investigations Division later confirmed an important detail to the media. The evidence collected in 1986 had not been re-examined for a very long time. It was this recent direct DNA comparison that ultimately became the turning point, conclusively identifying the source of the genetic profile, first developed in 2001, a profile that had remained without a known owner for more than 2 decades. In other words, the final piece that solved a mystery spanning 4 decades did not come from some revolutionary new technology. Instead, it came from returning to the original evidence and examining it again with a different investigative approach, demonstrating that sometimes the answer has been there all along, waiting only for the right moment and the right method to reveal it. With this decisive DNA match in hand, prosecutors now possess what appears to be the essential legal foundation needed to move forward with the case against Charles Barry. All that remains is the next step in bringing the matter formally before the courts. Unlike most criminal cases, where the gap between an arrest and a trial is often measured in just a few months, the journey toward justice in the Roberta Walls case still has a long road ahead before it can truly come to an end. As of now, Charles Barry remains in custody in Connecticut, the state where he was arrested, with bail set at $10 million, an exceptionally high amount that reflects both the seriousness of the murder and sexual assault charges he faces, and the significant flight risk authorities believe he poses after living outside the reach of law enforcement for 4 decades. Before any trial can officially begin, one mandatory legal step must first be completed: Barry's extradition from Connecticut back to Virginia Beach, where the crime occurred 40 years ago and where legal jurisdiction over the case ultimately rests under U.S. law. Under the American legal system, interstate extradition can take anywhere from several weeks to several months, depending on whether the defendant agrees to return voluntarily or chooses to challenge the transfer through legal proceedings in the state where they are currently being held. The process is designed to protect the defendant's legal rights, even though it can sometimes delay the delivery of justice. At this stage, the case has not yet gone to trial. Everything the public knows so far is limited to one fact. After decades without a single lead capable of identifying the person responsible, investigators have finally identified and arrested a suspect. For Roberta Walls' family, this is the moment they have waited for through 40 long years of uncertainty. Yet the road to a final legal judgment and, perhaps, a true sense of closure still requires time before it can be fully completed. 40 years is long enough for a child to grow up, build a family, and become a parent. It is also long enough for many of Roberta Walls' loved ones to pass away without ever seeing justice served. For all those years, her family lived with a question that had no answer. Who took the life of the daughter, sister, and loved one they cherished so deeply? Every year without an answer only added another layer to a grief that never truly faded, a quiet, persistent pain they carried every day. Some losses can never be healed by time. People simply learn to live alongside them. For Roberta's family, 4 decades of unanswered questions became a constant presence, an empty space with no face and no name, yet one that lingered through family dinners, holidays, and every milestone where Roberta should have been. Yet Roberta Walls' story also leaves behind a powerful lesson. It stands as a testament to the enduring strength of forensic science and the unwavering determination of investigators who devoted years of their careers to seeking justice for someone they had never known. Although the person responsible appeared to have vanished beyond the reach of the law for nearly 40 years, the truth ultimately found its way back. It is also a reminder to all of us that, in an era of rapidly advancing forensic DNA technology, no crime, no matter how carefully it is concealed or how many years have passed, is guaranteed to remain hidden forever.